Madam Speaker.
Members, please be seated. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this point, I move that we move to rise and report progress on Bills 17 and 7.
Having heard the motion to rise and report progress on Bills 17 and Bill 7, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. We shall now rise and report progress. The Honourable Member for Athabasca, Barrhead, Westlock.
Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports progress on the following bills: Bill 17, Bill 7. Madam Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by the Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 3 sub 1.2, I wish to advise the Assembly that there shall be no morning sittings tomorrow, Wednesday, June 17th, Thursday, June 18th, Tuesday, June 23rd, Wednesday, June 24th, or Thursday, June 25th.
Excellent. Committee Hall. I'd like to call Committee of the Whole to order. Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 18, the Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020. Are there any members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to Bill 18 on the Provincial Parole Board establishment. I have a number of serious concerns about this decision, and I want to just walk through a little bit over the next little while. The parole service is an important service in our criminal justice system, with the very difficult responsibility of making determinations about the readiness of offenders to return to the community after having been convicted of a crime and having spent time in jail, paying restitution through that conviction and time in jail. And it's one of the fundamental philosophical underpinnings of the nature of parole, that the crime and punishment relationship is such that if someone has broken the law of the province of Alberta, or indeed the laws of Canada, that they are given a time in jail as a way of deterring them from engaging in that kind of crime in the future. And I think it's important that we remember that the time in jail is intended to be a punishment, particularly for a particular act against the law. Now, that's all obvious, but the reason why I go through it is because the underlying philosophy is not a bunch of other things that I want to talk about for a minute. It's really only about giving someone a penalty for having committed an act, and spending time in jail is that penalty. If we start to attach other things onto the penalty, then we are actually subverting the underlying intent of our criminal justice system. That is, if we start to say that we want to shutter people's abilities to regain access to society indefinitely, or if we make the decision to somehow invalidate their rights and opportunities after the point of time that they have served their sentence, then we're not really talking about punishing someone for the crime that they have committed, but rather we're talking about seeking vengeance on somebody because of the upsetness we have with what they've done. And that's a very dangerous place for us to go to in the administration of justice. If the administration of justice is based on the notion of vengeance, then the likelihood of bad things happening in society increases. That is, you end up with a state that makes determinations about the value of a human being and the right of the state to dislike that person and to act against them because they dislike that person. And that's not a place we want to go. We've seen everywhere in the world where the states have taken that kind of position, that it's really turned into a terrible anti-democratic process. And so what we want to do is we want to make it really clear to people in society that there is a cause and effect on their behavior. Should you break this law, the consequence will be that you spend some time in jail. Not that we dislike you or we don't want you part of our society anymore or that we're angry and therefore we get to do whatever we want. That's perpetrator thinking that just because you've made us upset that somehow we get to do whatever we want. And we certainly don't want the government to be acting in a perpetration mode. What we want is the government to say that this is about law and order. This is about keeping a civil society. This is about preserving the security of the individual, both in terms of their body and the things that they might happen to own. And given that that's the underlying fact of our judicial system, it's important that we then understand that parole has a very important role in the application of our judicial values. And that is that we are not allowing the government to punish you and hurt you because we are mad at you. We are merely responding appropriately with the right kind of punishment for the crime that's been involved. Once you've spent your time in jail, the needs of society are such that we want you to get back out into the community and to alter your behavior and become part of a successful society. The punishment is over. We're not supposed to continue disliking you and treating you poorly. We're supposed to say the crime has been done, the punishment has been administered, and now it's time for you, instead of going out into the world and causing grief and sadness for the people around you, you need to go out into the world and help to build up the positive world that we want to have. And in order to do that, we know that a significant number of offenders are going to need significant support in order to be able to do that. That there are reasons why they became an offender in the first place. Now, it's nice to be able to say that they just made a bad choice. And I wish that were true, that the reason why most offenders become offenders is because they simply choose poorly, that they don't have a good value system and they choose not to do that. But in reality, we know that that's really not one of the primary reasons why people become offenders. That, in fact, the vast majority of people who become offenders because of structural drivers in their lives. That is, the things that have happened to them have pulled them in a direction that is very unfortunate. You know, I've recently had an opportunity to spend some time watching an American television show called The Wire. That was quite popular a few years back. And it's about the selling of drugs in Baltimore. And one of the seasons was really about the children in the drug trade. And the children who are 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 15, who are drawn into this life through a variety of disasters in their life. Parents who are addicted, poverty, racial prejudice, lack of opportunity, and so on. And one of the things that really demonstrated is this argument about the structural drivers that push people in a particular direction. It's not that they don't have some choice along the way, but that for many people, you would have to be an exceptional human being to overcome all of the drivers that are pushing you toward crime. And the nature of the parole board is such that we are trying to examine, is this person in a place where they have the skills and talents and the abilities to overcome the drivers that are pushing them more toward crime? Or are there things as a society we should be doing to facilitate their ability to overcome those drivers? And if so, then it is requisite upon society for our own benefit, if not for the benefit of the individual, to ensure that they have the opportunity to get the resources that are necessary. So the parole board has a very important purpose here, and that is they should be spending time determining whether or not the structural supports are in place to counteract the structural drivers that are going to push or pull that individual back into a criminal lifestyle. And if we are going to have a parole board in the province of Alberta, it's very important that we understand that that's what it's about. It's not about keeping bad guys in jail. We know we can keep bad guys in jails. We could simply change the punishment for every crime to be longer and longer and longer. We could say that if you steal a loaf of bread, you're going to spend 30 years in jail. There was a time when that actually happened. There was a time in not the too distant history where many of our ancestors in places like England and Ireland, they actually faced that kind of punishment. Or they might even get sent to a colony in Australia or Canada. So I think it's important that we understand the nature of what the parole board is doing, and understand that if we are going to make a decision to create a parole board in the province of Alberta, that simply creating the parole board without ensuring that they have extensive resources to ensure the well-being of the society through working on the structural drivers that are causing people or pushing people, moving people toward a life of crime, then we're really not doing the job that we're supposed to be doing. It's not simply a matter of whether or not can you get out of jail. The question is, how will you be successful once you're out of jail? And that's what it is, I think, that we need to be careful about making sure that we maintain. Now, in this particular case, the government has made a decision they want to have a local parole board. But, I question whether or not it's because they actually have thought through what is the purpose of a parole board, and will we actually be able to provide those resources that deal with the structural drivers that move people toward criminality better if we have it under the control of the provincial government than if we have it under the control of the federal government. And they presented absolutely no evidence that they, in fact, have resources here in the province of Alberta that they would not be able to apply if it were done by the federal government. In other words, if we look at what is the cause, the underlying reason for having a parole board, they presented no evidence that that reason will be enhanced if we have it within the control of the provincial government. So the question is, why would you do it then? If you're not going to be able to provide any kind of different service at all, if you're not going to be able to do anything new, why would you duplicate a service that is already in existence in this province? Is this contradictory to their claims that they're against red tape, that they don't want duplication in government. They actually are going to create a whole new system when a system currently exists without demonstrating even once one aspect of this new system that will enhance or better the actual functioning that will be performed by this parole board. So it begins to make you wonder what it is that they're doing. And I'm afraid the thing that concerns me most about that is that it really isn't about what the parole is about. That making this parole board isn't really about providing a circumstance under which we will try to move offenders from being offenders to being non-offenders through dealing with the structural drivers that have brought them into this place and providing structural supports that will keep them out of jail in future. Instead, what I can only imagine is that this government is looking to go back to that 15th century notion of, we don't like you because you committed a crime, so therefore we get to do whatever we want to you. And we want to tell you that you're a bad human being because it makes us feel that we are better and more powerful. It's an ancient notion of criminal justice, crime, and punishment that we're bringing forward here. If that's what it's about, if it's about looking tough on crime. We know it doesn't actually change the amount of crime in society to act tough on crime. We know it doesn't actually move people from being offenders to non-offenders. We have lots of research about that process, about how to move people, and it has nothing to do with our trying to make them feel bad about who they are. In fact, I think there's some fairly good research that demonstrates that the more we make people feel bad about their criminality, without doing the work to actually give them the skills to stop their criminality, the more likely they are to continue to engage in that criminality. Just referred to as labeling theory. Now, I think that's a dangerous place to go. If you can't actually provide a parole board that's going to do something new and better, why would you create one at all? And if what you're trying to do is you're trying to go back to an ancient system of punishment for the sake of hurting people through a state-sanctioned process, then I think we're in trouble. It belies the research underlying the work that people have been doing for the last number of years on how is it that people end up in these positions of becoming perpetrators, and how do they end up in a place where they no longer are perpetrators. And so I really want this government to reconsider, I would like them to reconsider the whole notion of a provincial-based parole board. Because I think that it's contrary to the ultimate hope that I think all Albertans have, and that is that we will have less crime in society, that we will have people who are doing less crime. In fact, we know the research on length of sentences, for example, doesn't actually correlate with the likelihood of whether people are going to commit the crime or not. That is, as you lengthen sentences for crime, you don't have a reduction in the number of times that crime is committed. But we do know that psychologically the research indicates that it's much more likely based on the likelihood of your being caught, or the likelihood of your having the type of structural barriers that would prevent you from committing that crime. That is, people around you who are witnessing what you're doing, people around you who are providing you alternatives to committing a crime, people around you who are providing supports for a better life. All of those kind of structural ways of dealing with crime are demonstrated to be much more significant than the punishment itself. And so I think it's important that if we're going to interact with crime in the province of Alberta in a way that with a desire to reduce that we not waste our time with setting up a parole board that will do exactly the same things as the old parole board did. Instead, that same money could be used for a variety of other programs that we know are going to have more effect on actually decreasing the likelihood that somebody is going to go back to committing a crime. And that means we could be putting this money that will be spent on this parole board toward things like restorative justice. We could be putting this money to community groups that work together to create a bond of social support, not only for themselves to help be aware of criminal activity that's happening around them, but actually social supports for those people who are most likely to commit a crime, so it will reduce the likelihood that they commit a crime. And I think that's where we have to stop, and we have to spend some time thinking a little bit about what it is we're doing here. We're going to be spending money on this parole board, and I think it's really important that if we cannot demonstrate that anything new is going to happen, that we reconsider and spend that same money that we would have spent on a parole board instead on the types of programs that actually help people move from that category of people that we refer to as offenders to the category of good public citizens. I know that there's plenty of research that's been done on this, and I know that there are concerns that we have a lot left to learn, that we don't know all of the mechanisms, but we certainly know that there are strong correlations between certain drivers and criminality, such as having experienced family trauma. If you were physically or sexually abused as a child, your likelihood of becoming a criminal when you're older increases. It's a driver. It doesn't cause you to do it. Don't get me wrong on that. What it does is that it's a force that moves you in the direction of increasing the likelihood of your becoming a criminal. We know other kinds of trauma also do that. Poverty, for example. Lack of education. Lack of knowledge of alternatives and possibilities. All of these things could be worked on, and they would reduce crime. So this money being spent on this parole board could be spent on all of these other kinds of structural drivers. And if they were, we're much more likely to have fewer criminals in our society. I know that sometimes people feel like there is a massive criminality out there and crime is rising. But in fact, the evidence is in Western societies, crime has been on a long, slow, steady decline for hundreds of years. The amount of crime, thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation rising to speak.
Well, thank you. I was interested in that diatribe just now, and I was just interested particularly in the end of it, where the honourable member just talked about how crime is falling on a steady pace, and I agree with that. But that kind of flies in the face of the fact that the other folks voted against our bill to prevent the seizure of legal property last night, when our side of the House voted for the seizure of legal property, guns that were bought illegally, knowing that. And they voted against that motion, knowing, as we know now, because the members just said, I know the crime rate is going down, but yet they voted to seize the legal property held by Albertans. In that scenario, completely inconsistent between what they did yesterday and what they say today. I was also interested in the members' long talk about retribution. It's a short bill. I read the whole thing again while the member was speaking. The word retribution actually doesn't exist in the bill. The bill, in fact, the parole board has nothing to do with retribution. It has to do with letting people out of jail when they're ready. In fact, on the Parole Board of Canada's site, it says the Parole Board of Canada is the Canadian government agencies that are responsible for reviewing and issuing parole and criminal pardons in Canada. It operates under the auspices of Public Safety Canada. So the Parole Board doesn't do any of the things the honourable member was talking about. Sounds like he's not happy with the jail system. Well, that has nothing to do with this bill. This bill has to do with when you let people out and when you don't, and making good decisions. So all the parole board has to do is make better decisions than they do in Ottawa. All this stuff the honourable member to talk about was interesting, and I might even agree with him on a great deal of it. But the fact is, it has nothing to do with the bill. So I guess he filled the necessary 10 minutes. He failed to talk about the bill.
Speak to the bill, the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I rise to
An amendment, so I will await that reaching you, and then I will read it in. Thank you very much. Thank you. That one, you can have that one. A1. Honorable members, this will be known as Amendment A1. Honorable member, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'm pleased to rise and speak to this amendment. I think this amendment is actually something that I hope our side and the government side can actually agree on. So I will read it out. I move that Bill 18, Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020 be amended in Section 4 in the proposed Section 27.2. A, in subsection 1 by adding subject to subsection 1.1 before the parole board comprises, and B, by adding the following immediately after subsection 1.1. The parole board must, A, consist of at least 5 members but no more than 9 members, and B, be comprised of at least Roman numeral 1 member who is representative of the Indigenous community of Alberta, and Roman numeral 2, 1 member who is representative of other minority communities disproportionately represented in admission to correctional institutions. So, Madam Chair, the reason I'm so pleased to be able to introduce this amendment is I think certainly at this moment in time, we're having a lot of conversations about the justice system. And I think it's clear, if we look at the outcomes of the justice system, that in fact institutional racism is a thing that exists. And I think it's definitely demonstrated fairly transparently in the disproportionate incarceration of certain populations. So I think in light of the fact that we know demonstrably that certain people are impacted more by the justice system, that in order to ensure that the justice system is representative of all people, that we make sure that those individuals who are overrepresented are in fact represented, well, in my view, on all boards, but on this board specifically, since this is the one that is before us presently. And I think this is really important. I think it's an important step forward. I think we have a huge number of Indigenous people who are absolutely eminently qualified. I think we have a huge number of members representing other minority communities disproportionately impacted who are eminently qualified to serve on this board. And I would like to think that it was the government's intention to ensure that this representation would exist in any event. And so if that was the case, then this is a very simple amendment to accept. It would simply require that there is that representation on the board. Now, obviously, not all members hear all matters coming before the parole board. I believe presently the quorum is 2 or 3 on a reconsideration. And I think that adding these individuals to make sure that representation was there would be good. More would certainly be better. I definitely think that. But, it's always been my view, and I think certainly it was something I worked very hard on, and that our leader, the member for Edmonton Strathcona, worked incredibly hard on, was ensuring that the boards that govern the people of this province have representatives from the people of this province, so that there is representation from all Albertans, so that everybody sees themselves reflected in their institutions, so that everybody feels like they are reflected in those institutions, so everyone has the opportunity to put their names forward and they feel able to do that. I think, people undervalue this. They make unfortunate comments about it, having to do with sort of tokenism and this and that, and I think that those comments are wrong, because as someone who is raising a daughter, it's important to me that when she grows up, because these implicit signals that we send in society, that only certain people can do certain jobs, only certain people can hold certain positions, those things aren't sent by what we say, they're sent by what we do. And I want my daughter to look around and see herself reflected in her institutions. That's why it's important to me that we do ensure that there are more women in the judiciary, that there are more women in politics, that there are more women in the boardroom, for exactly that reason. And I think it's important for all different people. I think that Indigenous people deserve to see themselves reflected in those institutions. I think that it is important that when Indigenous children grow up, they can look at the institutions in our province and they can see themselves there. Because I think that it very subtly sends signals to our children as they grow about what they can and cannot do. And I think it's incredibly important that people think about putting their names forward. We talk a lot about underrepresentation of various communities in a lot of public life. And I think one of the solutions to that is ensuring that as people grow up and they think about what they can become, they're able to look around them and say, look, there's someone like me. I think that this will go some way towards that, and I think that the justice system could honestly use a lot more of that. And I think it's worth having the conversation about, because implicit in this, implicit in this counter argument that I hear all the time, that I see online, that seems to spread throughout society, implicit in this counter argument that if we require members of underrepresented groups to be appointed to boards, that they're not qualified, or they're not getting it for the real reason, and that's just simply not true. When we talk about, for instance, people of color being underrepresented, I mean, not just in the judiciary, but probably in the entire legal profession, it's not because there aren't enough qualified people. That's not the problem at all. It's that the system is set up to let certain people through, or to privilege certain people and not others. And so we need to do something to rebalance that system, to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity. And I think when we're talking about something like a parole board, it's not just an institution. It doesn't just have that signaling function. I think it really does require representation from people who have lived experience. We've had a lot of conversations, I think, recently about racism, but the truth is that many of us in this room don't really understand what that feels like. I certainly don't. And so I think having people who do understand what that feels like, who have had that experience, represented, who are able to bring that experience to the table, who are able to speak to it, who are able to have that lens and that perspective, and who are able to share it with the other people on the board, that's really, really important. And as an entire province, as a country, as a world, begin to address these issues, particularly in the justice system, I think it's definitely time to consider moving forward on some of these issues, to consider taking active steps, because we've been talking for a long time. And I'm not saying we haven't made any progress, but I don't think that our progress has been sufficient. And so I think that we can make more progress. And we make more progress by taking active steps. Sitting around in a room and talking about it and hoping that it will happen on its own hasn't had the effect that we want it to. And I think there's a lot of good evidence that it probably won't, that we need to take active steps. We need to think about these issues, and we need to talk about these issues, and we need to try to move forward on these issues. Because it really is a question of fairness. It really is a question of the moral authority that the legal system has to bind us and where that authority derives from. And that authority really does derive from the people. If the people do not support the justice system, if they do not buy into the justice system, then it isn't really working. And I'm not saying that any criticism of the justice system means that we ought to toss it out. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I am saying is that I think there's an increasing number of people who are looking at this and saying it isn't working. And so we need to start taking some steps to reconcile that. Because if there are people out there who feel, and if there are an increasing number of people out there who feel that this system is unfair to them, that it targets them, that it does not have the moral authority to bind them because we are not, in fact, all living by the same rules, which is the fundamental premise of that system, then I think we need to do something about it. And this is just one step on the way to ensuring that we are doing something about it, to ensuring that at least in this one place, we have the chance to start fresh. This is a brand new board being set up. Presently, this work is done by a federal board. We'll bring in a provincial board. It doesn't hear that many applications, but it is still a board that will do work, that will impact the lives of Albertans around us. And so I think that because of that, this gives us the opportunity to move forward and make a positive change in the system to ensure that there is at least one representative of the Indigenous community, to ensure that there is a representative of other minority communities, to make sure that those voices are heard and that they're reflected. And I think this is a small step. It's one of a number that I think we need to take, but I believe that these sorts of provisions ought to start to pervade appointments to the justice system. Certainly, that was a lens that we took, and I hope that that is a lens that this government will take, because it's critically important that everyone has the chance to participate. It's critically important that people who, and again, I don't think there's a problem with a lack of skills. I think people have the skills, but some people are more likely to self-select in. Some people with the same skills, usually white males, who have, say, an identical skill set to someone who is a woman, to someone who is a minority, they will self-select into a job and assume that they are good enough and they can do it in a place where someone else might not. And whether that's subtle signals that are being sent by our society, whether it's never having seen someone do that before, there's any number of reasons. But I think these steps are critical. These people who come before the parole board are likely to be, are more likely to be because of the overrepresentation from these groups. And I think that they ought to have the opportunity to be heard by someone who can understand their experience in maybe a way that I can't. So with that, I will take my place, and I would urge all members to vote in favor of this amendment, because I think it is an incredibly important improvement. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pleased to rise to speak to the amendments brought forward by our opposition House Leader here tonight. And that amendment is, I think, a very timely and important one that all members of the House should see fit to pass. It's not anything other than uncommon sense, let's say. I know that we are living in a period of time when our senses are heightened regarding the race relations in our society as well as all societies globally. The world is watching, and it's incumbent upon us to adopt the changing sensibilities and the real realities that have been confronting us for a long, long time, and we failed to incorporate into legislation. And this is just one small way that we can certainly acknowledge the changes that should have been made a long time ago in recognizing the fairness that we must have in our society with respect to race relations and equality and our justice systems and all facets of our government administration. And this amendment goes a long way to placing a small part of fairness in something that otherwise would simply be another white bread example to our racial minorities in our province of being forgotten and being ill-considered. I know that any individual who is facing a parole board hearing currently under the federal system, if indeed they were a visible minority or other than the white demographic, would be, I think, justified in wondering how fairly the judgment of granting a parole will be granted, given that nobody from the perhaps Indigenous community or the other minority communities as proposed by this amendment are representing the parole board. So federally, of course, that they might have their own rules, but I think provincially it's up to us to, wherever we can, set an example that the members of our population who are the minority, people of color, who do face criminal justice systems, feel a sense of fairness and feel that they their concerns and their cultural distinctiveness, their ethnicity is being considered when a parole granting exercise is underway. I am not in great favor of the bill itself. However, given that the government seems intent on pushing forward with implementing an Alberta parole board, then I think we might as well at least make some amendments that will have it reflect not only the times but the reality that we live in, and incorporate the sense of justice that is being demanded globally by racialized communities, that their justice system and the enforcement of our legal system is something that recognizes the injustices of the past and seeks to correct them. I think that the role of government is to ensure in the justice system that it not only is fair, but is seen to be fair. And I think that if one looks at the demographics of those who have been convicted and sentenced to various types of crimes, and those individuals who are serving a period of incarceration in our penal systems, there are overwhelming injustices there in those numbers, showing that the racialized communities are disproportionately incarcerated and sentenced to periods of probation currently provincially. And when standing before a parole board, I think individuals who will now be facing a period of parole being granted to them provincially deserve to have the opportunity to be judged by a representative group of their peers on that parole board. And the period going forward that this government and future governments in this province should be looking into is a system where appointments to various provincial bodies, agencies, boards, commissions, parole boards going forward must always be made through a lens of fairness and not necessarily and I really don't really think the word is properly used anymore, but not necessarily something that would be called affirmative action, because as a member previous to me speaking indicated, that is sometimes thought of as lowering the bar in terms of those qualified to become appointed to in this case, the provincial parole board, and that's not the case whatsoever. There are ample members of the community, the racialized communities or the Indigenous communities, as the amendment proposes, to be appointed to these boards in the province of Alberta. And I think to argue that this is somehow perverts the system or the quality of the appointees is a really unfortunate conclusion to make, because right now the system that we have in place, where these guidelines are not enshrined in legislation, has led to a system which has caused, I think, a perpetuation of the disproportionality of incarceration of racialized communities, and in the federal case, I would say, in all probability, a disproportionality in those individuals who serve a longer period of time incarcerated rather than on parole. So it's incumbent upon all members of this House to look through the lens of today's world, and also to put oneself in the place of one's fellow Albertan, whether you be a Caucasian male of privilege or whether you be the newest member of our society, immigrated from some other portion of the world, and you may be a racial minority. And each time that you take that different role upon yourself and think of yourself in sitting in front of a parole board hearing, awaiting judgment to see if you're going to end up being given an opportunity to join your family and the community after a period of some time in incarceration, the last thing that you want to have going through your mind is if these individuals are sort of voting for or against the probation granting based on a bias that is sort of built in to their own cultural lived experience. And I think knowing that the parole board will have at least one Indigenous community member and one other minority community member from a group of individuals in the community who are disproportionately represented in admissions to correctional institutions will give some solace and some sense of justice, some sense that the review of their peers meaning a cross-section of individuals in the province who make up the parole board, that is a greater sense of justice being granted to the individuals being considered for parole, in my humble opinion. And I certainly have had a little bit of an introduction, as I mentioned in this House before, to the criminal justice system in terms of my experience as a volunteer in the court intake unit as a probation officer, and have had opportunity to speak to individuals who had been sentenced to probation, not so much to those who had been incarcerated, but just those who had been given a period of probation alone. And definitely there's a sense of despair and hopelessness expressed by, or sense that I could sense in the minds and the hearts of many of those individuals I met with, either in the courtroom before they left after being sentenced to probation, or if I met them in city cells before they were released, that told me that even a period of probation, and I assume a period of parole, should the Bill 18 pass and the parole board is in place, it's a serious matter. It's a sanction that you have upon yourself as an individual, a member of the community, where that community is telling you basically reform yourself or you'll find yourself either behind bars for the first time or back in jail. And of course, currently in Alberta, a period of probation may follow a provincial court sentence, and that is a pretty strong sanction, and for the most part is a pretty good break on recidivism, and I fail to see the real reason that the provincial government now seems wanting to go ahead with parole for 2 years less a day sentences, provincial sentences, rather than maintaining the current probation system as we see it as a sanction to incentivize the decision not to repeat offend and end up in jail. However, we are looking at a Bill 18 and the amendments there too, which would set up a provincial parole board that this government seems intent on enacting. And in so doing, I think it's incumbent upon us as the opposition to implement amendments that will make it reflect the population of the province, not just so it is fair in that way that we are reflecting our own demographics, ethnicity and race and so forth in the appointees to the parole board, but also that we are recognizing that there are disproportionate numbers of racialized populations who are serving terms of incarceration provincially in the province right now, and that should be embedded in the parole board appointment system as well, insofar as we should be making certain that there are always going to be parole board members who are from those communities who are disproportionately incarcerated in a provincial system, and they should actually bring to the parole board a much better understanding and comprehension of the cultural values and mores and understandings and practices, thought process, philosophy of those individuals who are members of the racialized communities that they've also come from. So it would be, I think, a significant improvement. There may be other amendments that could be made to this Bill 18 that I think would go in the same direction. For the moment, I think the member for Calgary-Buffalo has brought forward one of the most prominent and I think obvious amendments that we should be approving quite quickly and passing in this legislature. I can't think of an argument that the government would want to make to counter this amendment. I hope that they see the wisdom of it. I certainly wouldn't want to be arguing against it. It wouldn't be something I'd be comfortable doing. So we'll let government members speak for themselves on that, but I would be feeling pretty awkward myself in this House trying to debate on the other side of this proposal to make this amendment. It would be an uncomfortable position to make. So I certainly we'd be very happy to hear from other members with arguments to make on both sides of this issue, and I look forward to being made aware of any concerns that others might have with the amendment, but I think I would like to encourage all members of the House to pass it and improve this legislation. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to rise in the House to speak to the amendment to the Bill 18 Alberta Parole Board Act. The reason I'm just, I'm happy and I'm speaking in favor of this amendment has been, I'm looking at the bill, but I understood on this as this bill proposed something that the framework that has been already being done under the Canada Parole Board. And if this bill passes, the piece of legislation we are discussing here. So most likely what this focuses on is duplicating the work that we already have the provision under the justice law, and I could not find the very reason how is this different, and what was the need, if this is not a different, what was the need of this piece of legislation, Bill 18, to be discussed, and what we're trying to achieve through it if we have already provisions that successfully actually serving the purpose that we're trying to achieve through this bill. So going through some of the information, I've seen that if we implement this bill, there is added cost to the Albertans. So government of Alberta will end up spending some tax dollars on this for implementing the work that in no way is going to make any better for the Albertans. So I'm not saying it is not wise to discuss the rule of law or to analyze and discuss and debate the problems that we have in with the law of justice. But in this such case, we are debating this in the House and right now discussing in the committee of a whole, spend a whole lot of time in the House. It does not seem that government really trying to put their focus on to that seems have been long due. My colleagues from Edmonton, Rutherford, and Edmonton, McClung have a long speech on this, emphasizing specifically the need if we are focusing on to help reduce a crime in Alberta in a way that could be more effective to focus rather more on what have been missing in a long history of Alberta and what gives, how would I say, I'm just trying to find, I don't want to say what gives the people, what triggers the individuals to commit a crime. In this whole information, I see that the government has been missing a focus, not even once if we were discussing something with regards to parolees and this justice system. There is a community that is disproportionately represented in jails, in the justice of law. They're serving imprisonment. So this was a time when government should have taken this opportunity to focus a little bit more on that, how we can help not only reduce the crime, but also, strengthening those communities to find out what those problems within those communities, their challenges they are struggling with, and how the government of Alberta can really help them actually get them better. If the government really gave a thought on this, and I'm just concerned, so what kind of study they have done, if they can share? So what is the difference and what kind of consultation and what are those consultation results? How did they come to this decision if they just established the Alberta Parole Board Act instead of Canada Parole Board Act and going to help Albertans anyway? And when it's obvious, it was a sad day for me today personally when the motion to debate racism, the historic racism in our province, was actually put down by the government House members. So at the time when not only Alberta, not only our country, but the people around the world, they are fighting. They're fighting very hard on the roads, on the streets, in debates, and not only that, on the steps of our legislatures, thousands of people demanding, justice and to stop historic wrong. The communities, they have been historically victims of systemic racism in this province. So not only that part, I thought like when we were only going through the time with those very moments, and this kind of issue is already on the rise, and then we are also bringing forward some of the arguments. This should have been a great opportunity for the governments if something that didn't come into your mind when you were drafting the bill, that was the opportunity to think about it, because you are going to invest public dollars on these bills that will produce no difference to Albertans in the end. I just wanted to, as my colleague from the Edmonton Rutherford actually very eloquently spoke on this issue, I would like to bring very small and brief experience of mine. Anybody who have little information regarding India probably would have heard the name of the great young martyr of Bhagat Singh. So one of his friends who served the jail time from his underage to almost till the freedom of India, about 17, 18 years in the jail. And he spent that whole time, developing himself and doing a whole lot of work, gaining the experience, talking to the people, specifically the people serving jail time in time on a death row, basically waiting for death. So he compiled a book that he named that book Time on a Death Row. So the number of people he spoke with those criminals, they are serving the death sentence, that they were ordinary people. Many of them were very young people. A number of them were, graduating from colleges and universities. Those were the, kind of the conditions around them. Their surroundings somehow triggered them, tricked them. That was a moment of time that changed their whole life. So when this young man brought them into the conversation to his cause, what he is doing, not only for the betterment of his life, but for the greater cause of betterment of the people of India. So those people, one by one, I think there were 11 of them, they just regretted. So if they would have gotten this kind of opportunity to get involved in something, definitely they would have been different people today, not just waiting for the death sentence here. I don't know how effectively I would have able to bring this argument into discussion, but I wanted to say, when we were discussing this Allen Adam in this house today, so how many more cases do you think we need? When we know we have obvious statistics, there are communities disproportionately representing the jails and suffering their victims of one kind of the problems that are related to this bill we are discussing. This amendment seems to me is very genuine and reasonable. That is the only reason I said this is my pleasure to rise. And this is basically, I think, that should be appreciated by the government house members. All we are asking to give a chance to the people from those very communities with lived experience. They have first-hand experience. They can bring that experience to the board. They have chance to voice and strengthen this act. And that is the reason I ask the all House members to support this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I see the Honorable Deputy Government House Leader is rising.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We listened carefully to some of the debate. Part of the issue that we're having with this item, and of course we would always, with all of our appointments, try to make sure that the Alberta is reflected, the people on boards and committees are reflected. This, unfortunately, this wasn't shared with Justice ahead of time, as far as I can tell. So, indeed, it also adds to the minimum number of people on the board, which makes the NDP's position a little bit inconsistent, where they were complaining in some of their debate earlier that we're spending money on the parole board, and then they roll out an amendment which would cause us to spend more money on the board by having a larger minimum number. So it's unfortunately, this will be a victim of poor planning. I think if the opposition wanted this considered more carefully, they probably should have warned the ministry ahead of time that it was coming.
I see the Honorable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie has risen to speak on it.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the member from Calgary-Buffalo for bringing forward this amendment, because I think it's incredibly important. And I also want to thank the member from Edmonton Meadows for reminding this House, perhaps not a lot of people know about Bhagat Singh, but Bhagat Singh actually inspired what is known as the Gadar movement back in India. And that Gadar movement was an anti-colonialist movement. What it's saying is that these systemic and colonial injustices occurred, created trauma, And as I've discussed many times in this House before, trauma is at the root of addictions. Trauma is at the root of these problems that exacerbate poverty, which at the root in itself is oppression. So whether it be here in Canada or whether it be in India, the struggle is one and the same. Is to correct the historical injustices that have occurred because of oppression. Now, I've even heard it in this House a couple of times where members on the opposite side get up and gawk at that word, oppression, as if it didn't exist. And that is a rewriting of history. To say that oppression doesn't exist within our province or in this world, wow, that's a fantasy world that I don't know who's living in that fantasy world. Because when you look at the history, world history, and you look at the history of Canada, to deny that oppression has existed within our history and continues to exist right now is a misinterpretation of reality. I also want to thank the member from Calgary-Buffalo for actually bringing this amendment forward, because it's something that we continue to work on in terms of trying to create a more just criminal justice system. Because, of course, as is well known by those who serve in our justice system, one of the things that the federal or that has been intended to be implemented at both the federal and provincial level are the fact that Indigenous people, when being tried, you have to go through what's called a GLADU report. And this is intended so that it could be a more equitable sentencing. So the person's past is taken into consideration. So, because we all know that the trauma that has come from these colonial and these colonial injustices of the past have then been passed down from generation to generation to generation. It's not just something that happens to the individual. And I can identify with that. Because as I've shared many times in this House, I get up and I talk about how I come from a country where democracy was crushed. People who had progressive ideas were killed in the streets. And that's a trauma that I continue to live with, even though I didn't experience it myself firsthand, because my parents experienced it. And then that reality was passed down to me and the next generation, and that's a history that I teach my children, because I do not want that history to be repeated. Not in Chile, not in India, not here in Canada, ever. We need to learn from this history. This amendment that has been brought forward by the member of Calgary-Buffalo is an attempt to make it a little bit more just. Or, pardon me. I keep saying Calgary-Buffalo, but it's actually Calgary-Mountain View. I'm sorry. My apologies. My apologies. So the member from Calgary-Mountain View, there you go, correcting the record, is just a small attempt to try to make it more equitable, so that at least if parole will be considered for people in the criminal correction system, then at least there'll be a representative from an Indigenous community to help out in that rehabilitation process. And then also, subsection B2, one member who represents of other minority communities disproportionately represented in admissions to the correctional institutions. So I'm proud to stand in this House and say that this is but one way, out of many indeed, but at least it's one small way that we can address the historical, colonial, racist injustices that have occurred in Canada's past.
Honourable members, we are on Amendment A1 for Bill 18. I see the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader has risen.
Yeah, no, I just thank you, and again, it's I wanted to thank the opposition for the amendment. We won't be supporting it, but I can assure all members of the House and Albertans that we're well aware there's lots of qualified Indigenous people in Alberta and lots of qualified people of all racial and minority backgrounds that will be considered, and because that's the way we do things, we provide those opportunities for people, and yeah, it's that will be considered, obviously, as we do with all of our committees, is that there's equal opportunity, and this is a great place where it would be wonderful if we can find I know there's lots of Indigenous people qualified, but you need to find qualified people that actually want to do the job as well as people from, as the amendment says, minority communities. And I'm hopeful we can, I know there's lots of qualified people from minority communities, and hopefully we can find some that are not only qualified but actually want to do this task.
I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford has risen.
Thank you. I promise I will be brief. I just wanted to stand up to support this amendment because I was speaking earlier about the issue of what's the underlying value in a parole, whether it's about retribution or whether it's about rehabilitation. And I won't go through that argument again. The issue for the Indigenous community that I speak to about this is that there is a decision being made here. That Section 27(7) actually says in it that the parole board may only grant parole when the release of the inmate will contribute to the protection of society by facilitating the reintegration of the inmate into society as a law-abiding citizen. So they're actually making a decision about this person as to whether or not it will actually be facilitate their reintegration. And what the members of the Indigenous community and other racialized communities are saying is that that decision very often reflects a underlying systemic bias about whether or not there is an intention for retribution or an intention for rehabilitation. And that's what they're talking about. They're saying that that's where the bias comes in. The value system that you bring into that decision in that moment systemically goes against Indigenous people more often than not. And so the intention of this amendment simply is to address the existence of a structural bias or systemic problem in the system, systemic racism, by putting a structural component in that says we should have people who understand that bias on the committee, on the parole board, so that they can make others aware of the bias and begin to act against the bias. That's the point of the conversation here, and I just want to support this amendment so that we can, by adopting this amendment, acknowledge what we've been asked by hundreds of thousands of people over the last number of weeks on the streets and in the legislatures, asking us to address systemic racism and the biases that they experience when they are in front of our institutions. In this case, it happens to be the parole board. Thank you.
I see the Honourable Minister of Health has risen to join debate.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I rise really just to correct some information about what parole is, I suppose, and how parole hearings are done at the federal level. As someone who sat as a member of the Parole Board of Canada, back then we called it the National Parole Board, for a number of years. The point of parole is that it's a form of conditional release, Madam Chair. And it's not our only form of conditional release in Canada. There are many other different types of conditional release. There are escorted or unescorted temporary absences, as well as the last third of an offender's term is served in the community as a statutory release. And as well as many other different types of conditional release. Parole is one of them, and the jurisdiction of a parole board, federal or provincial, would be able to make decisions about those forms of conditional release. And the way that the federal, the Parole Board of Canada, deals with making sure that the hearings have the opportunity of making sure that they are culturally responsive hearing process. He's keeping in mind that the point of these conditional releases, including parole, Madam Chair, is to make sure that the risk to the community is going to be mitigated. What is the risk of the offender in returning to the community, and can it be mitigated? What is the criminal history of the offender? What was the institutional behavior of the offender in the institution? Is there a release plan? And what was the programming that the offender attended while in the institution? And looking at all those factors, you can determine whether an offender is low risk, medium risk, or high risk to reoffend. And to be able to make those decisions, we can still make the hearing process culturally responsive for First Nations and Métis and Inuit offenders by taking into account the uniqueness of Indigenous culture and heritage. And so one of the ways that thing can happen is by having elder-assisted hearings. And so in an elder-assisted hearing, there is an elder who attends and assists with the process of the hearing. The role of the elder is to attend and be a cultural advisor to the parole board members, as well as the hearing officer who attends. The offender will always also be represented as well with their parole officer who attends with them as well. And so for those folks who are attending the hearing with the offender, the role of the elder is to help make sure that everybody understands the very specific culture and traditions of the community and the experiences and traditions in general. And the elder as well may be able to offer wisdom and guidance to the parole board members. And so what happens in an elder-assisted hearing, Madam Chair, is at first there's the introduction of the elder. There then will be a smudge and a prayer for everyone to participate in. There's an explanation of the process then to be followed for the offender and the parole board members to understand, an explanation of the process and the safeguards that are there, the procedural safeguards for the offender, the hearing process, and as well as a closing prayer after the deliberations and the decision is provided. So, Madam Chair, I think that there are other opportunities other than through this amendment for us to ensure that, like the Parole Board of Canada, that we can have processes in place for a provincial parole board to be culturally sensitive to offenders of many different backgrounds, and that would be a much more effective and appropriate way for these types of accommodations to be made to offenders, Madam Chair, rather than the amendment. So I would encourage all members to vote against the amendment.
Oh, I see the member for Brooks Medicine Hat has risen to join the debate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say it's nice to see you in that chair. I haven't been speaking while you were the chair at any point, so congratulations on that new role, member, and Madam Chair. But I do want to say that I was surprised by the motion that was put forward by the opposition. I know that there's no question in this room or in this House or in this province that there is systemic injustice that occurs towards many people. I acknowledge that personally, and I know that our government has acknowledged that as well. In fact, I was surprised to hear the member for Edmonton Ellerslie, I believe it was, a couple before me, assert that somebody in our caucus or somebody in our government had denied that oppression exists. I did, and I will admit, Madam Chair, it wasn't an exhaustive search, but I did a search of Hansard for the entire session since I've been an MLA, and that certainly hasn't been said. So I'd be interested to know when that happened, and maybe provide some more information from the member would be great. But, I just have to say, when I see these kinds of ideas brought forward from, and it's usually from a certain group, I have to say I get a little frustrated when I see the NDP talking about us needing to have effectively a quota in order to have something be effective. I know that as a woman, especially a young woman who is in politics, not to have to qualify that or anything, but it's an objective fact. I'm young, I'm female, and I'm an MLA. So, I know that I've had many people say to me, well, they just wanted a woman, so they put you in there. They needed a woman in Southern Alberta, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So from my own experience, I can say that when somebody denigrates my role to the fact that I am a certain gender, or that and completely negates any kind of work that I've done, or any kind of qualification that I may have, I find that insulting. Now, I can't speak on behalf of all people, obviously, because I come from a certain area and I am who I am. But I will say, Madam Chair, that I find it curious that, we have an opposition here who does not acknowledge the fact that we had the very first Minister of Multiculturalism in this province, does not acknowledge the fact that a record number of women ran for the United Conservative Party in the last election, does not acknowledge that we have an extremely diverse caucus with a variety of backgrounds, with a variety of lived experience, all coming to the table with ideas and solutions. And they're also not acknowledging the strides that have been made on former committees and task forces so far. I mean, we have people from all walks of life, all ethnocultural backgrounds, different stages of life, ages, gender, you name it. There's people who have been qualified and applied for these spots have been put on these committees. So, I find it a little strange when I hear things like, well, I want my daughter to see she's reflected in these committees. Well, at the end of the day, what we should be wanting for our children is that they get things on the basis of their merit, not because somebody thought that they needed a special chair. I don't need a pink chair in the legislature to tell me that I can be here, Madam Chair. I just work the hardest. And at the end of the day, what you can do is you can encourage people to apply. You can encourage people to run. You can encourage people to get involved in their community, to learn more, to network. You can show them that. I mean, I ran because I had networked and I had got involved, and so the same can be said in any structure. You just have to take the first step, and sometimes that requires helping someone out. But at the end of the day, this isn't about this kind of a committee, and I don't doubt that there are qualified people from all backgrounds. And I don't doubt that our Premier and especially our Minister of Justice would imply or suggest that anybody couldn't be a part of these committees because of those things. But in order to say that you have to fit a certain demographic in order to occupy that seat on a committee is ludicrous. You don't need a special spot, and I know that our government is it stands with people from across this province, all Albertans. We represent all Albertans, and on something like the parole board, I'm sure that the Minister of Justice has ideas and will be consulting and putting the appropriate people on the board, and the outcome of that is yet to be determined. I hope if we pass this important piece of legislation, but I remain consistent in the fact that it is essential that we have people appointed on the basis of merit. And at the end of the day, if I'm appointed to something because I'm female and not because I'm the best person of the job, that's an insult to me, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
I see the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View has risen to join debate, and I apologize for not recognizing her last time. I saw her too late, so please accept my apology.
That is just fine, Madam Chair. It gives me the opportunity to respond to two at once. So we'll begin by addressing the comments from the Honourable Minister of Health. I can only say I think that I disagree. He's quite correct. Our legal system does have other methods like the Gladue decision, like a number of other ways to sort of try to grapple with the existence of basically adverse effect discrimination. I believe, it is my belief, that having someone from that background on the board is a better way to to deal with that than those sorts of laws, because they've been in place for quite a while and they haven't made a lot of progress. So I think we just have a difference of opinion there, and that's fine. But I do think that I need to address the comments from the member from Brooks Medicine Hat, and I won't address everything that was said in there, but Madam Chair, to have a member stand in this House and talk about how these sorts of amendments come from certain groups, I think that's pretty offensive, and I think it's inappropriate. I also think it's inappropriate to suggest that if you make space for women, for minorities, for people of color, that somehow you are tokenizing, because that's absolutely not true. And if it is the case that simply by standing around and waiting for things to level themselves out, they would level themselves out, that would have happened by now. And yet it isn't the case. We don't see that equalization occurring in boardrooms. We don't see it in the justice system. We don't see it in this place. We still see women earning 80 cents on the dollar for every man. That is not because they lack merit, as the member for Brooks Medicine Hat suggested. It is not because they are less qualified, as she suggested. It is because the system is set up and has been set up to privilege certain individuals, and in order to rectify that system, which is set up in order to provide greater opportunity to certain individuals, you need to take certain steps. When you're addressing a system, you always need to look at what the system is producing and where the incentives are and how the system operates. And I think to suggest that by taking these sorts of steps, you're not promoting people based on merit is absolutely wrong. I believe the point is to recognize equal merit. The problem with women in the legal profession, the problem with women in politics is not that there are not women of equal merit. The problem is that the women who have the same skills don't necessarily step forward at the same rate. And so knowing that that is a problem in the system, we need to hold space for those individuals. That is the case with minorities of many, yeah, there's a long list, and I think that by suggesting that holding space for people of color, you know, to suggest that the reason that historically people of color have been underrepresented in these areas is because they lacked merit, and to suggest that we have a merit-based system now. I mean, really, the logical implication of that is that these people lack merit, and that's why they're not coming forward. And that just isn't the case. We know it isn't the case. We know it's the way the system is set up, and that's why we are trying to rebalance the system. So I take objection to those comments because I think that they are incorrect. I think that adverse effect discrimination has been recognized in law as a legal principle since the 90s. I think there is an enormous amount of sociological and psychological evidence to validate that that is the case. Yeah, I simply think that to hold space for individuals is a necessary step. And that is all I have to say about that.
Honourable members, we are on Amendment A1 for Bill 18. Are there any other honourable members wishing to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. On Amendment A1, as proposed by the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? No. That amendment is defeated and a division has been called. Please call in the members. Honorable members, a division has been called on Amendment A1 for Bill 18, the Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020. Would all those in favor of the amendment please rise?
Ms. Ganley, Member Ceci, Ms. Sigurdsson, Mr. Fian, Mr. Egan, Member Loyola, Mr. Nielsen, Mr. Dack, Mr. Diol.
Would those opposed please rise?
The Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mr. Shandro, the Honourable Mr. Taves, the Honourable Mr. McIver, the Honourable Minister LaGrange, Mr. Gottfried, Mr. Lowen, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, the Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Ellis, Mr. Yassin, Ms. Goodridge, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, Ms. Isaac, Mr. Reid, Mr. Newdorf, Ms. Glasgow, Mr. Churton, Mr. Rosewell, Mr. Yao, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Getson, Mr. Walker, Mr. Long.
Madam Chair, total in favor of the amendment 9, total opposed 25.
Honorable members, that amendment has been defeated. We're back on the main bill, Bill 18, Corrections Alberta Parole Board 2020 Amendment Act. Are there anyone wish to speak? I see the honourable member for Edmonton-Tickford has risen.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to rise here this evening to speak on Bill 18, Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020. My comments will be probably fairly brief this evening. I want to look at this from a very specific point of view as the critic for red tape reduction. And so it's my understanding that, should this House make the decision, because I'm not presupposing it, of course, to move ahead with the creation of its own parole board, we understand that in the past we've seen roughly about 50 applications that this would apply to each year, which, if we stretch that over the course of the entire year, that would be one hearing per week, and guess what, we get, give those folks 2 weeks off at Christmas time. The proposed cost, roughly, around this parole board would be about $600,000 per year, which, again, if I just quickly divided that amongst the number of average that we're seeing at about 50, which is about $12,000 per hearing. And so when I'm looking at this, one of the questions I would have liked to have asked the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction that if we are looking at having both of these systems at the same time, are taxpayers on the hook for the cost of both of those, which then, if that is indeed the fact, what is that in terms of red tape? Is that not duplication, which is completely against the mandate of the red tape reduction is to eliminate duplication. So by creating our own provincial parole board, we would be in effect duplicating a process that already exists. And so I'm curious as to what kind of consultations were done with the Associate Minister of Red Tape around the formation of this, and does it contravene the mandate that his ministry was given? And if he did give any advice around maybe not pursuing this, why was it that that advice then was potentially ignored? And so other than, some issues around, say, for instance, the quorum of the board, out of 5 members, only having 2 consisting of quorum kind of goes against all the definitions of quorum, which, when we look in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a number such as a majority, of course, that word, that majority that members opposite love to refer to around the election, yet are ignoring it here in this case, but such as a majority of officer members of a body when duly assembled is legally competent to transact business. So I'm just wondering, if there's only 2 members present and they both disagree with each other, now they're at a stalemate, what happens with that, which is usually why you want to have a majority of those individuals. My other question, of course, revolves around remuneration for these members. How is it going to compare to other jurisdictions? Are we going to try to be the best paid, the least paid? We always hear about trying to retain good talent here within the province, but as we've always seen, sometimes you have to pay for that talent. So I'm wondering how that works into the financial plans within the province. And so, I'm hoping maybe we might hear some answers around that, what kind of advice the Associate Minister of Red Tape gave with regards to potential duplication, things like that. Hopefully, we will get the opportunity to maybe hear some of those answers at this time. But with that, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Honourable members, we're on Bill 18, Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020. I see the honourable member for Calgary Buffalo has risen to join debate.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have a amendment I'd like to put on behalf of the member from Calgary Mountain View, and I have it here. I'll wait till clerk takes it to you, Madam.
Amendment will be known as Amendment A2. Welcome to proceed, honourable member.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. With regard to the MLA for Calgary Mountain View's amendment that I'm putting on her behalf, and I'll just indicate that it's with regard to the annual report section on 30.2, and it would be to move that Bill 18, Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act 2020 be amended in Section 8 by striking out the proposed Section 30.2 and substituting the following. I'll read it through and then have a few comments to make, if that's okay. 30.2, number 1, at the end of each fiscal year, the Parole Board shall prepare and submit to the Minister a report setting out A, the number of parole applications received for the fiscal year, B, a summary of the Parole Board's decisions for the fiscal year, C, the costs associated with the operation of the Parole Board for the fiscal year, D, any recommendations of the Parole Board in respect of the supports and programs that the Minister should implement to reduce recidivism, and E, any other information that the Minister may require. And then there's a number 2 in that amendment. And on receiving the report referred to in subsection 1, the Minister must lay a copy of the report before the Legislative Assembly as follows. A, if the Legislative Assembly is sitting on the day that the Minister receives the report as soon as practicable. And B, if the Legislative Assembly is not sitting on the day the Minister receives a report within 15 days after the day on which the Legislative Assembly commences its next sitting. And that was submitted, as I say, by the member from Mountain View, Calgary Mountain View. And Madam Chair, obviously 30.2 lays out the parameters of an annual report to the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. And in the bill, rather short bill, there are 3 sections, A, B, and C. And what we have added to it through the member from Calgary Mountain View is a new C and a new D. And it makes great sense to say that the costs associated with the operation of the parole board for the fiscal year shall be tabulated and provided to the minister. And D, the addition of essentially recommendations to reduce recidivism, which is actually what we all want in society, for people who are leaving custody not to go back to custody. And the parole board members, through their actions and activities with those incarcerated individuals that are seeking parole, would gain some insights as to what would be beneficial for the province to enact as supports and programs to better ensure that recidivism is reduced, costs to the government of Alberta are reduced via incarcerating fewer recidivists, and we, of course, they want that in terms of the parole board, the people who are working with those individuals, and the individuals likely themselves would rather stay out of jail and walk a straighter line in the future. The second section, and then the A, B, and E in our amendment is the same as what's identified in this bill. And the second section speaks to sharing the information that is provided to the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General to, in a sense, be more transparent about the actions of the parole board, because in this bill there's no indication that the report would go beyond the minister. Certainly they may be interested in sharing that information, but with the amendment it's incumbent upon the minister to do that sharing, and that's a pretty common feature of many related agencies and commissions to the province of Alberta, that those reports are tabled here in the House for all members of the legislature to review and to gain knowledge from, and ensure that the tax dollars of citizens, as well as the actions of the entities themselves, are on the straight and narrow. So I'm certainly supportive of the actions identified here. I think they make greater sense and add to and are a more robust reporting structure than is identified in this rather brief bill. And I would put it before and hopefully receive the support of members of the legislature in this regard. It would go some way in terms of redressing some of the criticism of this government that has been tabled with regard to the lack of transparency. And it's not me saying that, it's others, third parties saying that about this government. And so in a sense, we're trying to help this government become more transparent through the submission of this amendment and the direction to the minister to put this report on an annual basis before the House so that all members can benefit from the information, instead of just the minister seeing it as bedtime reading for himself, which he probably doesn't want to do anyway. So I would hope members of this House would support this amendment on behalf of a member from Mountain View, Calgary, who has put it forward. Thank you.
Honourable members, the Committee of the Whole has under consideration Amendment A2 under Bill 18, and I see the Honourable Minister of Health has risen.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I just point out that right now in the bill that's before the House right now, in Section 3.2 sub 1, that 30.2, which the Honourable Member is seeking to amend right now, the current draft, is that it says that after the end of each fiscal year, the parole board shall prepare and submit to the minister a report setting out, and then there's 3 subclauses there enumerating what is to be reported to the minister, and it is the number of parole applications received for the fiscal year, a summary of the decisions for the fiscal year, and any information that the minister may require. And I would just point out, Madam Chair, that is significantly more detailed than what is in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act that the Federal Parole Board of Canada must comply with, which is just that they report on their operations, showing their operations of the service for that fiscal year, Madam Chair. And so I think right now what we have is a draft that is providing a significant amount of information to be reported to the Minister, and that would be sufficient, and I would recommend that all members vote against the amendment.
The committee has under consideration Amendment A2 on Bill 18. Are there any other members wishing to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, I'm prepared to call the question on Amendment A2 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo on behalf of the Honourable Member for Calgary-Mountain View. Are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? No. And that amendment has been defeated. We're back on the main bill, Bill 18. Are there any honourable members wishing to speak to Bill 18 at this time? Seeing none. Clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Agreed. Opposed? Carried. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 19, the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020. Are there any honourable members interested in speaking? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to rise and debate Bill 19, Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act. So, of course, we're sort of late to the party here in Alberta. We're the last province in Canada to bring forward legislation regarding vaping. And so I'm pleased that the government has done that in this bill. However, there is certainly some significant concerns with the legislation that's before us, and it goes some way to regulating vaping in our province, but not far enough, certainly as far as I'm concerned. And some of the key concerns about that are, well, twofold, and it is because there hasn't been a banning of flavors. That's one of the things about vaping. If you can have an assortment of flavors, and so oftentimes young people are very attracted to that and can get them sort of hooked into that lifestyle, which we know isn't a good one. We know that vaping isn't good for you. It is harmful to our lungs, mouth, and can even lead to COPD. So it's not something that we want our young people to be doing. And of course, those flavors, they tantalize them. And they think it's like candy, sort of. It's like it's fun, and it's not going to hurt them, because the flavors sort of mask that. But of course, that is the opposite of the truth. So, certainly I'm disappointed that the government is not banning those flavors as they have done in many other jurisdictions, and that has gone a long way to help young people not be so attracted to it, because that is, as I said, quite tantalizing to them. Another thing is just the concentrations of the nicotine, and those levels are much too high also. And that does, of course, we know from many, many years of research that rapidly creates addiction in people, and certainly in young people. And so, again, that's the second piece of this legislation that should be reconsidered. It's a concern that it is such a high level of nicotine. And what's surprising is that it kind of flies in the face of the chief medical officer's recommendations to this government, and also in May of 2019, while the current Minister of Health was in his role, there was a submission to Health Canada by AHS that said exactly those two things, that flavors should be banned and the nicotine concentrations need to be less. And so under this minister's watch, the Minister of Health, those things were brought forward and submitted to Health Canada. So it's confusing to see this legislation that doesn't hold those two aspects. And as recently as January 2020, Alberta's chief medical officer did say exactly the same thing, banning flavored vaping products and restricting nicotine content was really important to make sure that young people are not enticed, wooed to play in this world of vaping, which is not a healthy one, and it isn't good for them. So it's confusing why the government is not respecting the science that's been done, not respecting the reports of their own department, and certainly the recommendations of the chief medical officer as recently as January 2020. But what does become apparent is that the big tobacco lobby, which of course is working very hard to get what it wants, is really kind of wrote this legislation. And that's why we don't have these things banned. And so we don't have any limits on flavors. There's no limits on nicotine concentration. I'm happy to table this, Madam Chair, but I'm just cut out from the Edmonton Journal, an article here from the editorial, and it talks about Bill 19 is quite simply a cop-out in the name of protecting children and youth. The bill mainly protects industry, not children and youth. It certainly says it gave big industry everything that they wanted. And certainly the opinion editorial is by SAVE, which stands for Stop Addicting Adolescents to Vaping and E-Cigarettes. It's an acronym, SAAVE. And I'll just share one paragraph here. It says, Canadians do not want their children and youth to be addicted to nicotine. They have said so, and frankly, with the low price of landlocked oil and economic harms of COVID-19, our province cannot afford a new generation of nicotine addicts who will cost the healthcare system billions of dollars. And so they're very disappointed, I guess, with this government, and I really don't feel that they have gone far enough to address this pretty significant issue. And really just given everything that the tobacco lobby asked for was given to them. And, that's a concern when we prioritize, big tobacco over, our kids. It disturbs me, and certainly, as I've talked about in this house many times, as a mom of 3 sons, thankfully none of them did smoke, and I don't know if I haven't heard any of them vaping, but perhaps that's happened behind my back. But I don't want to do anything to make it easy for them or any kids in our province to entice them, like making out that it's some kind of a candy treat or something with those flavors. So I guess I just want to say I don't want to talk too long on this issue, but I think that those are those two key points that are so important, and I just really asked the government to look at this legislation and see that their own ministry, their own Alberta Health Services plus the Chief Medical Officer have also brought these two concerns forward, and that one of the challenging things is that we know who the tobacco lobby is, of course, and we know that it kind of reads like a who's who of the UCP. So it includes Nick Coulsbergen, the Premier's campaign director, Brad Tennant, the former executive director and fundraiser for the UCP, Sonia Kant, also director of fundraising for the UCP. So, I mean, it sort of shows that, you know, they were able to influence elected officials so that they could get what they needed for their big corporations, and not taking care of the public interest of young people in our province, making sure that they aren't enticed into this lifestyle that's not healthy for them. And of course, as the authors of this opinion editorial say, you know, it's going to cost us more in the long run. If people aren't well, you know, there's all sorts of difficulties in terms of your health associated with vaping, smoking. So, I mean, it's disturbing to know that there's such a close connection with this UCP government and the big tobacco lobbyists. And just to quell any kind of concerns people may have that, oh, well, you know, this vaping will help people stop smoking, because sometimes it's said, well, it's sort of a lesser of the two evils, but there really isn't any good scientific data to actually prove that. So I just want to refute that argument right up front. So really on so many accounts, I mean, it's important that we make sure that our young people are safe and that they don't get enticed into this lifestyle. So I really ask this UCP government to take the best interests of young people at heart, because having the flavors, having the high levels of concentration of nicotine is only going to entice them and get them hooked, and that's going to be really challenging for their life going forward. So obviously those are, you know, significant concerns, and I certainly will not be supporting this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I trust the honourable member from Edmonton Riverview, as she mentioned, will table that in the House during the daily routine tomorrow. I see the Honourable Minister of Health has risen to join debate.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we are indeed late to the party. As the Honourable Member mentions, Mr. Speaker, for 4 years under the NDP, we saw youth vaping rates almost quadruple. They had 4 years to be able to deal with this, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Chair, and they failed to do it. 4 years to be able to table legislation where they could have started to address the vaping, the increasing vaping rates in our youth, and they refused to do it. They let down our children, they let down teachers, and they let down parents, Madam Chair. And why? Instead of...
Everyone to speak through the chair, please, and we'll have order.
Madam Chair, the honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo is very talkative tonight, and he's still even talking now. He's so upset because I think he's really embarrassed of the fact that for 4 years they failed our youth, they failed our parents. They never dealt with the quadrupling rate of vaping amongst our youth. They had 4 years to deal with it. Madam Chair, the honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo is sitting there laughing because he is so embarrassed about the failure to be able to deal with this. We are, in Alberta, late to the party, as the honourable member for Edmonton Riverview said. Now, look, Madam Chair, I think it was a little bit of an embarrassing situation to hear the honourable member disclose, I think, how little she is aware of the situation. Maybe she had a researcher hand her only portions of the notes that she needed for tonight's speech. But look, there was a letter. It was a letter that was signed by all of the chief medical officers of health throughout the country, and Dr. Henshaw was one of the folks who signed that letter. It was dated January 22nd of this year, Madam Speaker. But what it says specifically, and is kind of embarrassing, as the honourable member is making random and I think bizarre references to AHS and reports to the ministry. I don't know what she's talking about, because she then makes it very clear that she's talking about this letter signed by the chief medical officers of health in the country. And it says, in quotes, Madam Chair, federal action would be preferred. And we agree with the chief medical officers of health, Madam Speaker. What this legislation does is takes the provisions that are in what is now the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Act, and the measures that that act has to be able to, I think, successfully address the smoking rates among our youth in Alberta and be able to reduce those rates. I think it shows that those measures were effective. If we can take those measures and apply it to vaping, that's a good start for us, Madam Chair. And it also enables, by regulation, for us to take action if needed, if the federal government fails to do anything further when it comes to vaping flavors. But since the honourable member for Edmonton Riverview is going to refer to that letter, it says, again, another quote, federal action would be preferred. And it's the same with the nicotine levels as well. Now, the honourable member wants to make the allegation that this legislation was drafted by the tobacco lobby, Madam Speaker, which I find laughable. I think she said, the quote I wrote down is, it was everything they wanted, Madam Chair. It is not everything they wanted. The legislation that they would have drafted is the legislation the NDP left us with no restrictions on vaping. That is the legislation that the tobacco lobby wanted to be drafted and had drafted for the NDP. What was the influence of the tobacco lobby on the NDP as for 4 years they ignored this issue, they ignored our youth, they ignored our parents? What is their explanation for 4 years of sitting on their thumbs, Madam Chair? Now, they want to talk about the influence of the tobacco lobby. I, as the Minister of Health, and the honourable member for Calgary-Klein, who chaired this legislative review, followed the guidelines of the World Health Organization that they've set for jurisdictions like ours when it comes to tobacco legislation and interaction with the tobacco lobby. We followed those guidelines, and any interaction is fully disclosed, Madam Chair. Fully disclosed for any Albertan to see. And look, we allowed them to make submissions, but the honourable member for Calgary-Klein is going to have to remind the House the number of Albertans and the number of smoking advocates that he met with, the smoking reduction advocates and the vaping reduction advocates that he met, the youth that he met who were upset that still in 2020 we didn't have legislation in this province to be able to address vaping amongst our youth. They were asking the member for Calgary-Klein for this legislation. Those are the youth that the NDP ignored for 4 years, Madam Chair. And again, Calgary-Buffalo is so upset and embarrassed, he's again heckling me. Because it drives him crazy that he let those parents down, he let the youth down, Madam Chair. They had the opportunity. The former Minister of Health must have met with smoking reduction advocates, must have met with the youth of our province who must have been begging as the rates were quadrupling in this province. They refused to take action. And so I look forward to the member for Calgary-Klein reminding us the sheer volume of submissions that he received from Albertans all over the province, written submissions online, as well as the consultations that he had in person with the many, many advocates throughout the province who are asking for this legislation. and as well the in-person consultations they had in, I think, at least 6 different municipalities throughout the province, because this was a full-scale consultation. I'm trying to avoid the word fulsome, Madam Chair, because I gotta admit I hate that word. But it was, maybe I can use in this situation the word fulsome. It was a fulsome consultation as he went throughout the province and met with Albertans who are asking for this legislation, Madam Chair, and that's what we've done. Unlike the NDP, who for 4 years, we came into office in May of last year, throughout the summer, last summer, started working on designing the review, appointed the member for Calgary-Klein to then chair the review, and he worked on it beginning at the end of last summer so that we could have this legislation. And unfortunately, it's been delayed by COVID. We were hoping to have this tabled before the House and hopefully been passed by now. We have been delayed by COVID, as COVID has delayed many things in this ministry. But we're proud now to be able to table this and to be able to start addressing the increasing vaping rates, because the member of Calgary-Klein and I are both fathers of young children. And we don't want this province to be left the same way that the NDP left this province, by ignoring these increasing rates. It's time for us to help our parents. It's time for us to help these youth. And that's why we're tabling this legislation, Madam Chair.
Honourable members, the Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 19, the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has risen.
With deference to the member from Calgary-Klein, of course, I just wanted to get up to say a couple of things around this bill. You know, certainly it is important to ensure that we do take action on vaping. As we know, vaping is an evolving issue over the last number of years. We saw the technology being marketed and say a smoking cessation tool, and then we've seen it emerging as a recreational drug as well. And so as this does move along, it is important to take action, and it's important to make sure we take the full advantage of this moment in time to get ahead of the game. And, you know, it's important to know that we have quite a lot of latitude and responsibility and authority to make changes to the consumption of nicotine through vaping, through this legislation that we have here today. And so I've said it a couple of times already, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it with an amendment as well. And if I could pass that round to, you know, perhaps contribute to building the best legislation that we can. Yeah, this is yours.
Will be known as Amendment A1 under Bill 19, the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020. As moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest, you may continue.
Okay, sure. We'll just get it passed around, but perhaps I can just summarize what's in the amendment. And it is the essence of it, Madam Chair, is to talk about the prohibition, I should say, of flavors, and as well to bring down the concentration of nicotine, and then, of course, the prohibition of the sales of those same things. And so, you know, I think we've said it a number of times, but just to, as a quick summation, that we know that the flavored vaping products serve as an attraction to young people in particular, right? And we know that when we prohibited the flavored tobacco
Member, I
cigarettes.
hesitate to interrupt you. If I could just ask you to read the amendment into the record, please, and if you will advise the Assembly if you're moving it or whether you're moving it on behalf of another member of the Assembly.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the member, on behalf of Member Shepherd, to move Bill 19, Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020, to be amended as follows. In Section 11, by striking out the proposed Section 7.41 and substituting the following. No sale of prohibited vaping products. 7.41, one in this section, prohibited vaping product means a substance referred to in that section. 1J22, that is A, flavored by any flavor other than a tobacco flavor, or B, contains a concentration of nicotine in excess of 20 milligrams per milliliter. And number 2, that no person shall sell or offer for sale a prohibited vaping product. The second part in B, Section 21, is by striking out the proposed Section 9C and substituting the following, which is to excluding a product, device, or substance other than a substance that is defined as a prohibited vaping product in Section 7.41, one for the definition of a vaping product, and second to in Section 21 by striking out the proposed Section 9.1. So that is the totality of the amendments moving on behalf of Member Shepherd. And so again, I think the amendment is fairly self-explanatory. It covers some of the issues that we've seen emerge in the public domain around debate and analysis of Bill 19, as the honourable member from Edmonton Riverview very helpfully brought to the House the article describing the concerns around flavoured tobacco and the advocacy that a number of groups have done to seize the moment, so to speak, Madam Chair, right, where we have this sitting, and again, we did have the submissions by doctors as well. That was an emerging issue, right, and the doctors that had described that, again, using this moment to take care of this business in the most comprehensive way possible, and we did see the chief medical officers from across the country talking about the urgency of looking at legislation, including the flavors, right? And of course, those chief medical officers did say that the federal government could deal with this, but the provincial governments could deal with it too, right? I mean, there's no sitting and waiting for Ottawa to get the deal done. Many other jurisdictions across the country have already done this flavored aspect of vaping restrictions, and I think that the evidence and conventional wisdom tells us that it's the correct thing to do. And so, let's all follow best practice here and to read and to think through what opportunity we have here around vaping and to make sure we cover off, I think, this aspect of it in terms of the concentrations of nicotine and the flavors that are in different vaping products at this point in time, and make sure we build something that is both responsible and logical and follows the best advice from the medical profession, including the Chief Medical Officers of Canada and the groups of doctors that did give us this same advice. Right? Oh, it's even on, as I see, it's on Alberta Health Services letterhead. So it seems like it's kind of like a recommendation from Alberta Health Services, as it happens, suggesting these very same things. Right? So, in the interests of collaboration and best practice in the House, I urge all members to consider the amendments, and let's get her done, and get her done now. And I look forward to any further debates in this regard. Thank you.
see the honourable member for Calgary Klein has risen to join
Thank
the
you,
meeting.
Madam Chair. And I just get up to address this amendment and specifically the comments around banning flavors. Actually, addressed some comments earlier about how most jurisdictions have banned flavors, which just is not true. When you actually look across Canada or even the United States or Britain, most jurisdictions have not done full flavor bans. There's been some flavor bans that have been done in convenience stores. There's been some restriction on some flavors, but there has not been, outside of, I think, Nova Scotia, full flavor bans. And so I thought I'd get that on the record. I'd like to point out that the comments that were made, and unfortunately, I don't know if the member was listening when I talked about this last week in regards to the big tobacco and who we consulted during this process. And as the Minister of Health has already mentioned, we consulted quite broadly right across Alberta with, I think it was 240 different stakeholder groups, from health advocates to vaping retailers to people, to children, to enforcement, to medical professionals across the board, as well as academics. And there was significant amount of evidence that came forward in the review, and I could encourage you to read it if you haven't already, that actually showed that vaping, well, there wasn't evidence that showed that vaping was any worse than combustible cigarette use. Now, there was evidence that it wasn't healthy for you, but it wasn't necessarily worse than tobacco use. And there was some evidence and argument that it might actually be less harmful for you than combustible cigarettes. And a significant amount of evidence and feedback that we got from thousands of Albertans through the process, both through the surveys as well as from the cards that were brought into my office, as well as emails that were coming to my office from adults that use this product, and cited flavors as absolutely critical to their success in moving from combustible cigarettes to this product. I think, again, we'd like to see nobody using any of these products, but until we have clear evidence that this product is in fact worse than combustible cigarettes, taking vaping flavors completely off the market, which is what this amendment does, would have the unintended consequence of taking this device or the productivity of this device out of the hands of many of Albertans who are currently using it as an alternative to combustible cigarettes in regards to getting their nicotine. And so I would be concerned, and this is why I didn't recommend moving forward with the full flavor ban. I would be concerned that the immediate removal of flavors would have that unintended consequences, and we would see a significant rise in adults as well as children using combustible cigarettes in order to meet their nicotine addictions currently. So the reason why we left flavors in the regulations is something that we can address going forward. As we learn more about flavors, as we learn more about this product, then we can move forward at that time and address it appropriately as we discover. Again, fully admitting that we were aiming at a moving target throughout this review. So to be clear, I think Nova Scotia is the only one that has had a full flavor ban across Canada, the United States and the United Kingdom. I don't know much beyond that at this point. At least I can't cite it. There's significant evidence that vaping products for adults can be used as a harm reduction tool, and to eliminate flavors would put those adults at risk. And I'm not prepared to do that, and thus I can't vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will just take a few brief moments to lend you some thoughts through you to the House of my opinions with respect to the amendment for the House. I believe that if we ask ourselves what exactly the bill and now this amendment is really trying to get at, of course, it's a public health matter. It's a matter of saving lives and maintaining good health in our population. And I know many members of this House probably were former tobacco consumers, smokers of one kind or another. I count myself as one of those. I smoked for 40 years until a little over 5 years ago, I packed it in. And I know that once that final decision was made, it was simply the act of ceasing to smoke that was the determining factor in actually being able to accomplish it. Some smoking cessation aids will help individuals, but one can only speculate, and I think the evidence is pretty clear as to why Big Tobacco was lobbying long and hard to support the flavored tobacco and tobacco flavor themselves in the vaping tools and cartridges that were used. Because as one knows, if you watch a little bit of television, there's a commercial for a tobacco cessation product that starts off with a statement saying that 1,200 Canadians a day quit smoking. And of course, they want to have them use their products to help them do that. Well, 1,200 Canadians a day are quitting smoking, Madam Chair. That tells me why Big Tobacco was so desperate to replace those smokers with younger smokers who will buy their products. And in order to get them to smoke, they first of all will hopefully get them to a product that they can legally promote, and that's not tobacco to young smokers. It would be flavored cartridges through vaping devices that they would be able to promote. And if you look at the investors in these vaping products, you'll see that Big Tobacco are the major investors. So they're not doing so because they have some altruistic notion of maintaining the health of Canadians or Albertans by assisting them to rid themselves of a tobacco habit. They're doing so to addict more young people so that they can continue their shareholders' investments and profitability in tobacco products that they are invested so heavily in. So keep that at forefront in your mind, Madam Chair, and I ask all members in this House to do so when they think about how we regulate vaping products and what we're actually doing when we do so. We're trying to protect the health of Albertans, and we do so by making sure that new smokers don't take up the habit. So I encourage all members of the House to at least go this far by banning the flavored tobaccos, keep the concentration of nicotine down to a minimum, to very much not allow a person to offer for sale a prohibited vaping product, so that we don't end up encouraging more young people to take up the habit, die early, have their health affected badly because they end up using and consuming tobacco products as a result of their taking the opportunity to try a flavored vaping product now. I started smoking, Madam Chair, on a school bus in grade 11. And that was the way things were back then. And you could light her up as soon as you got on the bus, and off to school you went. There was an area in the high school that was protected between the gym and the rest of the school for smokers. And it was the foyer. And times have changed, and rightfully so. And finally, I was able to kick the habit, and this is what we want to prevent, is young people starting the habit so that health isn't affected like the health of many smokers are. So with that, I hope it gives people pause to reflect on their vote and decide to support this amendment. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to start off by appreciating the amendment from the Honourable Member from Edmonton Northwest, and as well the comments from the member for Edmonton McClung. And I can appreciate their focus on trying to reduce not just smoking in the province, but also vaping, and the vaping among our vaping race among our youth. I really appreciated hearing the personal story of the member for Edmonton McClung and how he started smoking. And look, what I would say, Madam Chair, is that first of all, when it comes to this amendment, what it was seeking to be done is two things. One is to prohibit flavors other than tobacco flavor. I would first note that the draft bill does include a provision to enable regulations and to prohibit flavors through regulation later on down the road. If we see the need, if we see the current restrictions the federal government has done and being insufficient and a need for government to step in and provide further prohibition on flavors. And especially when it comes to the concentration limit as well, in subclause 1B in the draft amendment that's been provided by the honourable member for Edmonton Northwest. I know, just to remind the House that the Canada Consumer Production Safety Act, the federal piece of legislation, already does set a cap at 66 milligrams per gram of nicotine. And we know that the federal government is considering whether further reductions in that limit have to be made. And I hope that the federal government, like us, consider all the available evidence before them, and as they continue to amend the federal legislation as well. But at this time, what we have here, as I said earlier this evening, is a piece of legislation that first starts off with the successful measures that the TSRA, the Tobacco Smoking Reduction Act, provided for reducing smoking rates among our youth, and taking those measures and applying it to vaping as well. And so I think what we have to do is start with those measures, see if they are successful. If they aren't, then be able to investigate whether the ministry and the Minister of Health have to be able to take further measures down the road. And so I would, at this time, encourage members to vote against the amendment, but I would like to acknowledge and appreciate the comments for the member for Edmonton Northwest and Edmonton McClung for their passion in trying to reduce vaping rates among our youth. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1 on Bill 19? Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A1 as moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest on behalf of the Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That amendment has been defeated. We are back on the main bill, Bill 19. Are there any speakers wishing to speak? I will call the question on Bill 19. The Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act 2020. On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? Carried. On title and preamble, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? Carried. Are now on the Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 16, the Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020. Are there any members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I rise to propose an amendment to the bill, and so I would like to confirm with the table that there is no amendment currently on the floor.
There's not currently an amendment.
Perfect. Then I will hand it, and I will await its arrival at you, await its arrival to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
So I move that Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020, be amended. A, in Section 9, Roman numeral 1, by renumbering the proposed Section 10 as 10 sub 1, Roman numeral 2 in Section sub 1. A, by striking out the minister may and substituting subject to subsection Subsection 2, the minister may. B, by striking out Clause A and substituting the following. A, grants relating to programs that benefit victims of crime. A.1, grants relating to programs that promote public safety. C, in Clause C, by striking out Clause C and substituting the following. C, programs and initiatives that benefit victims of crime. C.1, programs and initiatives that promote public safety. And Roman numeral 3, by adding the following immediately after subsection 1, subsection 2, the total amount that is paid from the fund in a fiscal year from April 1st to the following March 31st under subsection 1A, B, C, F, and G must not be less than 75% of the total amount paid from the fund for that fiscal year. Subsection B, in section 21, in the proposed section 17 sub G.1, by striking out section 10C and substituting section 10(1)C or C.1. And so, Mr. Chair, what this amendment is doing is essentially ensuring that 75% of that fund continues to go to victims of crime or programs that support victims of crime. So the minister has said repeatedly with respect to this matter that this is about, quote unquote, it's not about redistributing the pie, but growing the pie. Okay, that probably isn't exactly what he said, but he definitely has referenced the growing of the pie on multiple occasions. And so if that is his intent, so obviously it is the case that the victim surcharge, which currently sits at 15%, is being increased. My understanding is it's being increased by an additional 5%, so that would be a 20% surcharge. What that means is that 15% or 75% of the money flowing into the fund is the money that was originally earmarked for victims, and this additional 5% is the growing of the pie, as it were. And so what this amendment aims to do is to ensure that that 75%, so that original money that was coming into the fund that has always historically been there, will still be spent on victims. And, you know, the minister has rightly pointed out that many of the initiatives that he is funding from this fund now are good initiatives, and I don't disagree. I think it is absolutely admirable that he has increased funding to the Drug Treatment Court. That program has a demonstrated history of success. It's a fantastic program. Many of the other things he's funding, certainly we know the Crown Prosecution Service has been strained for many years. That's certainly a good thing to fund. You know, many of the initiatives that he is proposing to fund are good initiatives. No one's saying that they're not good initiatives. I think the concern is that in this moment when we're having a conversation about using social services to support people who are instead falling to the police, that cutting those services in order to strengthen law enforcement is maybe not the best way to go. So the intent here is just to ensure that the money that was originally earmarked for victims still goes to victims, and the additional money in the surcharge can then go to the other programs that the minister wants to go to. I still think that we ought to have a clear divide and that the Victims of Crime Fund ought to be for victims. But if the government is going to proceed, which I understand they are, I think that this would significantly improve the bill. You know, the initiatives that are supported through the Victims of Crime Fund are important too. I know the minister has spoken about the importance of the initiatives he's supporting, and that's true, but, you know, I think, for instance, you know, our government had increased the grant to ASAS to support survivors of sexual assault and to help them through their court process. That is, to me, an incredibly important program. we had announced, after doing a lot of work on the Victims of Crime Fund, to ensure that we were sort of understanding what the needs of the victims were and how best to meet them, which is the work the Auditor General had asked us to do. We had already increased funding to some victim service units directly, and we had a number of programs that the government had started to ramp up that were in the next fiscal that obviously have been stopped under this current government. So one of those was so in Calgary, we have Homefront. Homefront is a fantastic model. It supports survivors of domestic violence. It's absolutely amazing. And what we wanted to do is to roll that model out to the rest of the province. So one of the things that was going to come out of the Victims of Crime Fund was going to be an agency to support folks throughout the rest of Alberta the way folks in Calgary are supported in the Homefront program, and I think that would have been a real improvement. So I'm sad to see that is gone. Another plan was, so we had increased funding to 5 victim service units, and those 5 victim service units were the units that had seen the most growth and were therefore under the most strain in their current budget. But that isn't to say that there weren't a number of other units that were under a significant strain. And so those units were supposed to see increased funding as well. We've also seen funding withdrawn from the Association of Police-Based Victims Service Units. I think that's very sad. So the association did a lot of the training, and I know a lot of the smaller victim service units are not going to, they're having to cut their training budgets as a result of this. Now, I know those cuts seem small in context to many people, but those victim service units operate on very small budgets. So they often have the budget for, 1 or 2 staff to sort of support the running of the unit, and other than that, it's run by volunteers who step forward to help their neighbors out. And it's a very good model. So I think that, those plans to increase funding to those areas, I think they were important plans. I know that we are in a time of fiscal constraint, but that's the point of the Victims Fund, right? That's the point of the fact that there was a surplus in the Victims Fund. That's the point of having this money earmarked specifically for victims, is to ensure that they still have access to that money even when we are in times of potential restraint. And so I think, those units needed increased funding. Another plan we had was to ensure that we were placing additional victims workers within the Crown unit. Those were to help victims of particularly violent crimes, things like aggravated assaults or sexual assaults, to help those individuals through the court process, because we know it can be incredibly challenging for a victim, and particularly if the victim is marginalized and perhaps hasn't kept in the best contact with victim services. They're being brought forward for trial, and there's sometimes they don't understand the process. The process is very traumatic for them. They may not be ready to deal with the process. And so having someone there who, at the very least, can help walk you through what's going to happen and the steps that are going to occur, because it's confusing for most people the way the criminal justice system works. I think a lot of people are surprised when they have their first interaction with it. So I think having those victim support workers, or an increased number, there are already some there, within the Crown Prosecution Service, to ensure that there's somebody to do that victim support work, because the lawyers have a very high caseload usually, just to assist people in being able to walk through. And I think that assistance with a number of victims actually results in better outcomes in court if the victim is emotionally prepared for what's going to happen, because it is unfortunately the case that often participants in the justice system read a victim's trauma as something other than trauma. They read it as an inconsistency or something like that, and that results in bad outcomes in our system not doing what it is meant to do. So all of those programs, in my view, are incredibly important, And so I think it's incredibly important to ensure that that portion continues to go to victim services and continues to go to victims. Now, one of the things that's being by and large eliminated under this bill is the direct benefits to victims of most crimes. And I think that's really sad. I've had people, and I will have longer conversations about this, but I have had a number of individuals who have reached out to me and said that they had received financial benefits under the victims program, and they've talked about how it saved their lives. Women who are talking about having to flee domestic abuse with nothing but the clothes on their back, and how they were able to use the funds that the financial benefits funds to assist them to reestablish their lives, or women who've been through incredibly traumatic sexual assaults, how they were able to use the benefits from the victims program to pay for some counseling to start them healing from their trauma. So I recognize the minister's point that maybe the program is different here than it is in other provinces. I don't think that's a weakness. I think that's a strength. I think that having financial benefits available to victims is important. And I've had a number of people reach out to me and to my office, and a number of people reach out to my colleagues to talk about just how incredibly important that is to them. So again, this amendment does something very simple. If the minister's intent is only to grow the fund and only to use that additional new money coming in to pay for the programs that he has referenced, then he ought to support this amendment. And this will ensure that there's a certain portion of the fund, that 75% of the fund is carved off, that will go to victims, and that victims will always have access to that victim services will always have access to that. And I think that is I think that's very important, so I would urge all members to strongly consider voting in favor of this amendment.
Thank you, member. Members will refer to motion by Calgary Mountain View as Amendment A1. Any others wishing to speak? I see the Minister of Transportation.
Chair, at this point, I would like to move to adjourn debate on Bill 60.
Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Minister of Transportation, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? That is carried.
I move that committee rise and report Bills 18 and 19 and report progress on Bill 16.
Members, are you in favor of the motion to rise and report? Aye. Opposed? That's carried. Recognizing the member from Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Committee of the Whole has had under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bills: Bill 18 and Bill 19. The committee reports progress on the following bills: Bill 16. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Thank you. Does the Assembly concur in the report? Opposed? That is carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 21, Provincial Administrative Penalties Act. Debate adjourned. Ms. Sigurdsson speaking.
Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I would like to thank all members of the Assembly tonight for the debate. Sometimes spirited, but it's always useful. And Mr. Speaker, at this point, I move the Assembly adjourn until 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, June 17th.
Having heard the motion to adjourn, all those in favor? Opposed? The House stands adjourned until tomorrow, 1:30.